The Beatles showed up uninvited to Dean Martin's show. What Dean did next shocked the music world. September 1964. The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Dean Martin was in the middle of his residency, performing to packed houses every night. A month earlier, the Beatles had knocked his song "Everybody Loves Somebody" off the #1 spot on the charts, ending their 14-week reign at the top. The music industry was buzzing about it. Young versus old, rock and roll versus crooners, the new generation taking over from the previous one. Every newspaper, every magazine, every radio show was talking about the changing of the guard. Dean didn't care. At least that's what he told everyone. They're good kids. They had their 14 weeks. I had my one. Fair is fair. He said it with a smile. With that casual Dean Martin shrug that made everything look effortless. But the truth was more complicated. Dean was 57 years old. The Beatles were in their early 20s, and watching them dominate the charts, watching Beatlemania sweep across America, Dean couldn't help but wonder if his time was passing, if the world was moving on without him. It was a Tuesday night. Dean was on stage, performing "That's Amore" to a crowd of about 800 people. Good crowd. Not sold out, but good. He was in the middle of the second verse when he noticed a commotion at the back of the showroom. 4 young men in suits were trying to get through the entrance. The staff was stopping them, checking for tickets, making a fuss. Dean couldn't see clearly from the stage, but something about the way people were reacting told him these weren't ordinary audience members. Then someone in the front row stood up and screamed, "It's the Beatles." Dean stopped singing mid-word. The band kept playing for a few notes before trailing off into confused silence. The entire showroom turned to look at the entrance. There they were, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The biggest band in the world, standing at the back of Dean Martin's Vegas show. The audience went crazy, screaming, jumping up, trying to get to them. Security was scrambling, trying to maintain order. Dean stood on stage, microphone in hand, watching the chaos. He could feel it. That moment when you realize the audience isn't there for you anymore. They were there for you, but now they're there for someone else. It's a particular kind of hurt that every performer experiences at some point. John Lennon saw what was happening and grabbed a microphone from one of the staff. "Excuse me. Excuse me, everyone. We're here to watch Dean Martin. We're not performing. We're just here to see the show. Please, sit down." But the audience wasn't sitting down. They wanted the Beatles. They wanted to see them perform. They wanted Beatlemania, not "That's Amore." Dean made a decision. He could let this moment define him as the old guy who got upstaged by the Beatles, or he could take control of it. "John Lennon," Dean called out from the stage, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Is that you causing trouble in my showroom?" The audience quieted slightly. John looked toward the stage. "Mr. Martin, we're terribly sorry. We didn't mean to interrupt. We just wanted to watch your show." "Watch my show? From back there? In this chaos? That's no way to watch a show." Dean smiled. "Why don't you boys come up here where you can see properly?" The audience erupted again. The Beatles looked at each other, uncertain. Paul took the microphone. "Mr. Martin, we couldn't. This is your show. We're just fans. Fans sit in the audience. Friends come up on stage. Now get up here before I have to come down there and drag you up myself. And at my age, that's going to take a while." The audience laughed. The tension broke slightly. The Beatles made their way through the crowd and up onto the stage. Dean shook hands with each of them. John, Paul, George, Ringo. The 4 young men who'd conquered the world, standing on his stage, looking nervous. "Gentlemen," Dean said into the microphone, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say the 4 elephants?" The audience laughed. "A month ago, these 4 talented young men knocked my song off the #1 spot on the charts. Ended my reign after just 1 week. And do you know what I said when I heard the news?" He paused for effect. "I said, thank God. 1 more week, and people might have expected me to work harder." The audience roared. The Beatles laughed, visibly relaxing. "But seriously," Dean continued, his tone shifting to something more genuine, "I want to say something to these boys and to all of you. Music isn't a competition. It's not young versus old. It's not rock and roll versus jazz or crooners or whatever label you want to put on it. Music is about connecting with people, making them feel something, And if these four guys from Liverpool can make millions of people feel something, then God bless them." The audience applauded. The Beatles looked moved. The newspapers want to make this a story about generations, about me being replaced, about the old guard versus the new. But you know what I see when I look at John, Paul, George, and Ringo? Dean looked at each of them. I see four guys who love music so much, they crashed an old crooner's Vegas show just to watch him perform. That's not disrespect. That's respect for the craft. And that's what matters. Paul stepped forward. "Mr. Martin, can I say something?" "Only if you call me Dean. Mr. Martin is my father, and he's been dead for 20 years. Paul smiled. "Dean, we didn't come here to crash your show. We came here because we're massive fans. Growing up, we listened to American crooners. Frank, Bing, you guys taught us about phrasing, about timing, about how to sell a song. Everything we do, we learned from listening to guys like you." John added, "When we knocked you off the charts, we felt terrible. We kept saying, 'We beat Dean Martin.' That's not an achievement. That's a tragedy." Dean laughed. "Well, I wouldn't go that far. You boys earned that #1 spot. Your song is fantastic. Catchy as hell. I've caught myself humming it in the shower, which is embarrassing for a man my age." The audience loved it. The Beatles were grinning. "So here's what I'm thinking," Dean said. "You boys came here to watch a show, but this audience clearly wants to hear you perform. And I'm not selfish. How about we make a deal? You perform one song with me, and then I'll finish my set." "Deal?" The Beatles looked at each other. Ringo spoke up. "We don't have any instruments." Dean gestured to his band. "You can use theirs. Unless you're scared to play with a bunch of old Vegas cats." John laughed. "We're not scared. But what song? Your choice. Pick something we both know." The Beatles huddled for a moment, then Paul turned to Dean. "How about Ain't That a Kick in the Head? We love that song." Dean's face lit up. "You know that song? We know all your songs. We told you. We're fans." What happened next became the stuff of Vegas legend. Dean Martin and the Beatles performed Ain't That a Kick in the Head together on stage. Dean sang lead, the Beatles provided harmonies and energy. Paul played bass, George played guitar, John played rhythm guitar. Ringo sat behind the drums. It shouldn't have worked. The styles were too different. The generations were too far apart. The musical approaches were incompatible. But it did work, because at the core, they were all just musicians who loved music. Dean's smooth, casual delivery blended surprisingly well with the Beatles' energy and harmonies. The Vegas band adapted, finding a middle ground between swing and rock. The audience went absolutely wild. When the song ended, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Dean hugged each Beatle. "Thank you, boys. You just made an old man very happy." John shook his head. "Dean, you're not old. You're timeless. There's a difference." "That's very kind. But I am old. I'm old enough to know that what you boys are doing is special. You're not replacing anything. You're adding to it, making music bigger. That's what every generation should do." The Beatles left the stage, and Dean finished his show. But something had changed. The audience had seen something they'd never expected to see. 2 generations of music, sharing a stage, showing respect, making something beautiful together. Backstage after the show, Dean and the Beatles talked for over an hour, about music, about performing, about the pressure of fame, about the fear of being replaced. "You know what scares me most?" Dean admitted. "It's not being replaced, it's being forgotten. Being seen as irrelevant." Paul nodded. "We worry about that too. What happens when the next big thing comes along? When we're the old guys? You embrace it," Dean said. "You appreciate what you had. You make room for the new, and you remember that music is bigger than any one person or any one era. It's a conversation that spans generations. You boys are adding your voice to that conversation. Someday, someone will add theirs. That's not a threat. That's beautiful." George spoke up. "How do you stay relevant? How do you keep people interested?" Dean smiled. "By not trying too hard. By being yourself. By understanding that you can't please everyone. And that's okay. Some people will always prefer the old. Some will always prefer the new. But if you're authentic, if you're true to your music, you'll always have an audience. Ringo asked, "Do you ever wish you were young again? Starting out in this era instead of yours?" Dean thought about it. "Sometimes. But then I remember that my era made me who I am. Your era is making you who you are. We're all products of our time. And that's what makes us unique." The story of the Beatles crashing Dean's show spread quickly. It was in newspapers the next day. Music magazines wrote features about it. People who were there told their friends. It became one of those legendary Vegas moments, but what made it legendary wasn't just the spectacle of it. It was what it represented. In a time when the music industry was obsessed with young versus old, rock versus traditional, the Beatles versus everyone else, here was a moment of genuine respect and collaboration. Dean didn't see the Beatles as threats. He saw them as fellow musicians, artists trying to connect with audiences, and the Beatles didn't see Dean as a relic of a bygone era. They saw him as a master craftsman they could learn from. Years later, Paul McCartney was asked about that night. "Dean Martin taught us something important. He taught us grace. He could have been bitter about us knocking him off the charts. He could have resented us. Instead, he welcomed us, celebrated us, showed us that there's room for everyone in music. I've tried to carry that lesson with me throughout my career." John Lennon, in one of his last interviews before his death, mentioned it too. Dean Martin was cool in a way we could never be. Not the manufactured cool, real cool. The kind that comes from being completely comfortable with who you are. That night in Vegas, he showed us what it looks like to be generous with your success, to not see every new artist as a threat. That stuck with me. Dean never made a big deal out of it. When asked about it in interviews, he'd shrug. "They're good kids, talented. Why wouldn't I want to share a stage with them?" But privately, that night meant something to Dean. It reminded him that he didn't have to fear the new generation, that his place in music history was secure not because he held on to it desperately, but because he'd earned it through decades of work and authenticity. The Beatles showed up uninvited to Dean Martin's show. They could have overshadowed him. They could have made him look old and irrelevant. They could have been the story that defined his decline. Instead, Dean turned it into a story about respect, about generations learning from each other, about music being bigger than any one person's ego. That's not just good performing. That's wisdom. And sometimes, wisdom is the coolest thing of all.